Black Midi has really pushed the note forward on just what music can be, or at least what British music can be. I mean, America's doing something different. We got Death Grips, we got Crystal Castles, they got some British guys singing some crazy songs, alright? Black Midi is definitely going to be one of those bands that heavily influence the next generation of artists in general. I feel like the next 10, 20 bands that we're gonna see pop up in the next decade are openly gonna say that Black Midi influenced them, because Black Midi is just so different from everything else, which I guess is a reason why people don't like them so much, because people don't like the new thing. They always want to hear the same old thing. Maybe they want to twist it a little bit, but once you hear something that's entirely unique and new, you definitely aren't going to be ready for it. And people definitely weren't ready for Black Midi when they first broke out in the scene. So let's talk about that. Before we really get into the video though, a guide to Black Midi, I'm going to let you know this is one of the longest videos I've ever made. I'm not going to be going into every single track and what they mean. I might do that for Hellfire because it's really important you like understand what the story of Hellfire is. I'm not going to be doing like some lyric analysis for a whole entire discography. I'm going to be going into the albums, what they sound like, what I think they mean to me, and their influence. And we're just going to go from 2014 to 2024, almost a full decade of Black Midi. But let's count 2014. What happened in 2014? Before the beginning of Black Midi, none of the members were really known in music. Maybe you could say Morgan Simpson was. He won Drummer of the Year in 2014. That's really all that happened in 2014. But after 2014, Cameron, Morgan, and Geordie started doing jam sessions together. They were originally doing them separately, but as soon as Geordie realized that they all had a really good sound, they started doing jam sessions as a band. The four of them decided to play together in different shows, and they were actually looking through different places to play their first shows and like get their sound known. After sending multiple emails out to people and like informing everybody Black Midi's a thing, they got a reply from the Windmill in Brixton. The Windmill is really important because this is where Black Midi first got their bearings in music. This is where the band Shame got their footing. At this point in time, Shame has already been pretty popular for a bit, so Black Midi actually leveraged Shame's popularity to get more listeners at their show. The first show that Black Midi played at the Windmill, they were visited by a man named
Dan Carey.
They were visited by a man named Dan Carey. Now, Dan Carey's pretty important because he is actually a very important guy in the London scene for music, and he was responsible for helping Black Midi get their first singles out around late 2018, early 2019. So at this point in time, they were playing shows at the Windmill in Brixton, and they weren't really known all that much. Occasionally, there would be a show where Black Midi was opening for a band like Shame, and Shame would say, "These guys are the best band in London," and then everyone would flock to them, and they would get shocked when Geordie starts singing his ghostly howls. So it was kind of difficult for Black Midi to progress. Geordie Greep did state in an interview that it was never just a instant rise to fame. It was always a slow walk to salvation. Around late 2018, Black Midi produced their first singles, Boom 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 and Speedway. Not to be confused with Crow's Perch and Talking Heads. Those were the first singles on Spotify, but these two tracks were released way before those two. At this point in time, the band has started to make a name for themselves. They might not have had the most listeners, but they had Dan Carey on their side, and they were willing to get an album out. And an album was what they wanted to make, so an album is what they made.
Shlagenheim.
At this point in time, the band was full speed ahead, creating and playing tracks at the Windmill as they were creating them. They were literally playing Shlagenheim tracks before the album was released at the Windmill. So at this point in time, if you frequented the Windmill in Brixton around 2019, you probably had a very fun time because Shlagenheim is great. One of the first Black Midi albums, Shlagenheim, is just a brilliant representation of how intense Black Midi could get. There are some songs on this album that I don't really like. At this point in time, Black Midi was in their early stages of being a band. And tracks like Speedway and Years Ago, I genuinely just don't like, but every other track is great. My favorite track is Western, mainly because it goes from these beautiful guitar passages immediately to just this crazy sequence of guitar and drums that sounds almost almost in the way dramatic, and it's very great. Another thing about Shlagenheim is that they used Dan Carey's studio to produce the album. They produced it in less than a week using synthesizers and different machines that Dan Carey had access to. Before this, Black Midi was almost live performance exclusively. They did only live performances. So they worked in synthesizers and DAWs to create the more experimental sound that we hear on Shlagenheim. Overall, Shlagenheim was probably one of the best debut albums I've heard in a while. They mix live performances with technological dissonance in a way that is confusing, fun, and in a way scary. Most of the tracks off that album could hold their own simply for just how intense and brooding they are. Black Midi makes their intensity almost a theme of theirs. You'd expect a band who does almost exclusively live performances to have some pretty good live shows, and you would be right. The Shlagenheim tour that happened for the most part in 2020 had 56 shows. They did 56 shows for their debut album. Keep in mind, only 7 months ago they were playing for like less than 100 people, so that was pretty good. I don't know what Geordie was thinking when he was like, oh, it was just a slow, gradual rise to popularity. Once Shlagenheim released, it must have. Most of their shows consisted of them playing their album track for track. Usually they'd even have some of their singles. They would just play shows. For the album's release, they just played shows that consisted of each song of the album track for track. They'd even play some of their singles like Talking Heads and Crow's Perch. They didn't make it to the album for a reason. I don't really like those songs that much. In some shows, Black Midi paired with Black Country New Road. This isn't really the Shlagenheim tour, but this is an important thing to note. Fans dubbed them Black Midi New Road. They had some pretty good performances. Another thing to note, Lewis Evans from Black Country New Road actually did some live performances with Black Midi. He played the saxophone at the KEPX live show that they were doing. While I was researching for this video, I came across this really weird thing called the Black Midi Variety Hour, which is a 7-episode series of the members of Black Midi playing songs from different styles, different genres, and different ways. It's I listened to the first episode. It was actually pretty fun. I enjoyed it a lot. But since the last episode was released in October of 2020, you're probably not going to be hearing that much anymore. The reason why I'm going so in depth about Black Midi shows is because they really do live shows like no one else. It sounds just as if they were doing like a live performance, and it's not like most like rappers nowadays or most single like artists like pop stars where they just do some light singing that no one actually hears and it's just dubbed over by the actual song. They play all the shows live, and it's just pure talent. Coming back to the Hyundai Mercury Prize of 2019, I already talked about this, but I'm just gonna like glaze over it again. I don't know. I just find it really funny watching all the people stare in horror while Geordie Greep is like, they moved with a purpose. Around the end of 2020, Kelvin did end up leaving Black Midi. Yes, he was there the whole time. I know none of the images show him, which probably is one of the reasons why he left. It says right here in the script that I'm reading, he took an indefinite hiatus, which bullshit. You've been gone for 3 years. You've been gone for 4 years now. You are not taking a hiatus. You're probably not coming back. Guys, it's time you let go. It's time you let go of Kelvin. Kelvin's not coming back to Black Midi. The one thing that brings this band together for me is their live shows. Once Black Midi releases their 4th album, I'm going to try to get to see one of their shows at one point in time. I don't care how much money I have, because it's just another kind of experience. There are artists who make their shows and their live shows a very important piece of their art, like Death Grips. You go to a Death Grips show, whole different beast. It's not like the normal music. It's different. Black Midi is also different in probably the best way possible. So now that they were getting all of this speed and steam from the first album, they had to release a second follow-up album to just benefit off that hype as much as possible. And Cavalcade, released in 2021, was just that album. Cavalcade is their second studio album from Black Midi, released in May 26th, 2021. The album has been praised for being an almost direct improvement from Shlagenheim, even though it had a very weird and different sound. You'll immediately note that there are some incredible differences in Cavalcade from Shlagenheim. For instance, heavy jazz notes. I'm getting a lot of heavy jazz notes when I listen to this music. And you probably wouldn't hear that in Shlagenheim, but this album is just different. This album was also produced in Dan Carey's studio, which they had access to. I don't really know how long it took them to make the album. Probably a lot longer than Shlagenheim because the album is a lot better. Cavalcade is just as intense as Shlagenheim, if not more so. The intensity of the band is reflected in their intense studio performances. For example, John L. is a crazy song that just is full of noise, and they perform it so effortlessly in all their shows that you really have to like ask if Geordie's like a robot. A fun fact about Geordie when making Cavalcade, it was known like in Geordie's like childhood that he was influenced by Miles Davis, a very, very prolific and respected jazz musician. So even though it's not confirmed, Cavalcade, you know, there's probably some link between Miles Davis and Cavalcade, which makes it based. Speaking of based, Lil B review coming soon. There are some tracks I don't really like all that much, like Dethroned, but in essence, the album is just so much better than Shlagenheim, because Cavalcade is just a refinement of all those different noises with a twist of jazz, and it sounds brilliant. But once you get into this stage where you're just releasing heat, and you're releasing more and more stuff, you get into this point where people are expecting you to make something great. Hellfire came out in 2022, and it's just so much better than Cavalcade in every other way. And it makes Cavalcade look like a 5 out of 10 compared to Hellfire's 10 out of 10. But let's talk about Hellfire. Let's talk about Hellfire right now. I'm excited. July 15th, 2022 was a very eventful day for Black Midi. They had just finished their best project yet. 10 tracks, 40 minutes. This eventful album would later be received as one of their best projects yet, and probably one of the best prog rock albums of all time. I'm of course talking about Hellfire. I mean this with no hyperbole, little to no hyperbole at all. Hellfire is probably one of the best albums I've ever heard. The noise, the expansiveness, and the sheer character and soul that's put into all of these tracks really speaks volumes to just how much Black Midi has improved throughout the years. Take for instance Sugar/Zoo. It's about a boxing match where a 3-year-old girl comes to get like a handshake from one of the boxers named Sun Sugar fighting a guy named Sun Tzu, and once the girl shakes Sun Sugar's hand and Sun Sugar turns around, she shoots him in the back and then is regaled as this, wait, is it a little girl or a little boy? The music video shows a little girl, but let's just say it's a little boy for the like lyrics purposes. He shoots Sun Sugar in the back and then he's like regaled as this hero, or regaled as this he states in the lyrics, Sun Sugar wouldn't be shit without me. So he's like, okay, I shot this guy in the back, but he wouldn't have been famous if he didn't get on that news article because I shot him in the freaking back. So I did him a favor. By shooting him in the back. Another song, The Defense, is about a pimp defending owning brothels. You can't make this shit up. These are 2 songs in the same album on like opposite parts of the album. And he's like, these girls are destined to hell, or so says our priest, but find me a Christian who spends as much time on their knees. Find me a Christian who spends just as much time on their knees, he says. But as you can tell, tracks on this album are a lot more story-driven. Geordie Greep's voice pairs almost perfectly with just the vibe of the album. And Cameron's voice very, very, very great suits this album in a way I didn't expect. For instance, Still is one of my favorite tracks off the album, and Geordie ain't even singing, it's Cameron singing. It's freaking Cameron singing. Eat Men Eat is another very intense story-driven track. Probably one of my favorite tracks off the album. I mean, I can't even explain this to you guys. It's about miners going to a cave, and on the last night of the caving expedition, they are told to eat whiskey, onions, and chilies. They're forced to eat whiskeys, onions, and chilies though, because their caving instructor, their boss essentially, is using the miners to create a wine with their blood, and using the whiskeys, onions, and chilies to like create the wine. So the cavers wake up, realize that that's happening, and they run away, doomed to like have wine in their hearts forever. But at least they expose like this bad company. They literally name drop Rio Tinto in the song, which I think is crazy because Rio Tinto is actually a real mining company. I can't make this up. I can't make it up. Listen to Hellfire. It's a great album. The experience that Hellfire brought to the table was more deserving of an amazing rating by critics. It got some very high ratings, some low to like high 9s, some high 8s, even some 10s. Almost. It was so close to the Anthony Fantano 10, you have no idea. I think it got a strong 9 from Anthony Fantano. But after this, they went on the Hellfire tour, and you get to find out, wait, they actually played Sugar/Zoo live. I have no idea how they do that. You listen to that song and you're like, how do they play that live? They play that live. I don't get it. But after the tours, nothing really happened. 2023, 2024, we didn't get much of anything. The only recent news we have about Geordie or any member of Black Midi in general is this YouTube channel called Full Screen Productions that's owned by Lewis Evans of Black Country New Road. And Full Screen Productions is probably the weirdest thing I've ever seen, like coming from a guy who makes like good music. For instance, Lewis Evans plays like the saxophone of Black Country New Road, but he also made top 10 darkest Simpson secrets in Full Screen Productions. And you can actually see Geordie Greep from Black Midi doing like a beer tasting, beer taste test, and he also unboxed the PlayStation 5. Sorry, I almost said Xbox because it's the superior console. But as of right now, Black Midi's nowhere to be seen. And we want you back. Black Midi has really cemented themselves as a band to look out for in the next 3 or 4 years. And while there's radio silence now, I do expect them to come out with some amazing projects in the next few years. They definitely wouldn't just stop making music. And that sounds like I'm overreacting, but when you release albums that often that are that good, you go silent for 2 years and it's like, are they ever coming back? Geordie, Cameron, and Morgan are all great musicians in their own right, but once you put them all together, it creates this beautiful symphony of noise and chaos that Black Midi monopolizes on, essentially. Overall, Black Midi is one of the weirdest and most unique bands I've ever had the pleasure to make a video about. The simple noise combined with these amazing live performances really just goes to show just how unique Black Midi is as a band. And this has been a guide to Black Midi. I'm just another music critic. I did a channel rebrand, and see you guys in the next video.
Send my love